Cuetlaxochotl. Cuetlaxochotl. I think I'm saying that right, but I might not be, so feel free to correct me. That is the name that lots of people are advocating that this plant should be called. This is the poinsettia, is what we know it as here in the US and in most of the world, but in Mexico they also call it Flor de la Nochebuena, and then the indigenous people of Mexico also call it Cuetlaxochitl. Now in Mexico, this plant, the marigold, is called the cempasúchil. I think that's how you pronounce it anyway. And no one is calling for this plant to be renamed from marigold to cempasúchil, but they are calling for the poinsettia to be renamed. Now, why is that? Now, the controversy comes from the man that the poinsettias are named after, who is Joel Roberts Poinsett. And he was the first U.S. ambassador to Mexico and the person that originally had poinsettias shipped to the U.S. Now, Poinsett has been documented to say a lot of things that are certainly not culturally appropriate or politically correct in regards to the indigenous people of Mexico and the people of Mexico that he was supposed to be helping to serve. And Poinsett, if he were alive today and said the things that he said back then today, he would be instantly canceled and justifiably. But the early to mid 1800s was a lot different than today's modern era. And Poinsett eventually went on to be one of the co-founders of the Smithsonian. But before we go and cancel the name of this plant that everybody knows, I do want to point out a few things. One is, I'm not sure that he necessarily appropriated this plant like some people are accusing him of. You see, back then, it was quite common for people who traveled around the world to document and send home samples of all kinds of flora and fauna that they found while they were traveling. And this is actually a very important part of how the global scientific community began to put all of their ideas together and classify all of the different organisms that we find on Earth. So when he saw the fantastic plant of the poinsettia that he found in Mexico that, the natives had been using for many centuries, he was awed by its beauty and wanted to share it with the rest of the world. And another interesting fact is he didn't name this plant after himself. Poinsett, with the help of some nursery growers in the US, started growing this plant, propagating it, and selling it in the US under the name Mexican fire plant, which was giving a homage back to its Mexican origins. And it wasn't until 1836 when botanist Robert Graham then renamed this plant to poinsettia in honor of his friend Poinsett. Now here's where we get into a little bit of gray area because it's my personal opinion. Although this plant does have its origins from Mexico, the modern poinsettia that you see grown today is really an American plant because these plants look almost nothing like the native poinsettias that you would find out in the wild in Mexico. They've now been hybridized and crossbred for over 100 years in the US, causing them to look completely different from the way they used to look. To me, I'm not sure that this plant as we see it today should be called the Cuetlaxochitl. But I would be totally fine if you wanted to go back and call the original species the Cuetlaxochitl, or Flor de la Nochebuena, or whatever you want to call it. It's also going to be pretty hard to get Americans to try and spell and pronounce correctly Cuetlaxochitl. I'm not going to go as far as to say that no, you shouldn't rename this plant or that we should stop calling it poinsettia, but by going back and renaming things, there's a bit of a slippery slope I want to talk about. Everything on Earth, every animal and plant was named by somebody. And most of them were probably named in the 1800s or early 1900s. And the people that named them probably would not be politically correct by today's standards. So if you're going to cancel Poinsett or the poinsettia for things that he did in his past, then you might be opening a can of worms by having to go back and look at, well, everything that's ever been named and judging those people by today's standards. Anyway, just my thoughts.